The first thing I noticed wasn't the water. It was the smell. If you've lived around land long enough, you learn that smell tells you something's wrong before your eyes do. That morning it smelled sour, heavy, like something had been sitting too long where it shouldn't. I stepped out onto the porch with my coffee and looked down toward the lower pasture, and even from the house I could tell something wasn't right. The grass was darker than it should have been. Not wet from rain, just wrong. I walked down there expecting mud. We'd had a week of steady rain, nothing unusual for spring in western Kentucky. I'd seen this land handle worse. But by the time I reached the fence line, my boots sank deeper than they ever had before, and that's when I realized this wasn't rainwater. Rainwater spreads out and disappears. This was standing. Thick. Stale. It had that oily shimmer on top like you see in parking lot puddles, and floating in it were things that sure as hell didn't come from my pasture. Plastic wrappers. Cigarette butts. A crushed soda can. My horses were standing up near the barn, watching me like they didn't trust the ground anymore. The water had pushed halfway across the field and was creeping closer to the barn wall. I stood there a minute just staring at it, trying to understand how land that had drained fine for decades suddenly decided to turn into a swamp overnight. Then I did what anyone who's owned land long enough learns to do. I walked the fence line. The back edge of my property runs along a tall retaining wall that belongs to the subdivision up on the ridge. Briar Ridge Estates. Big brick entrance, neat sidewalks, houses that all look like they came out of the same catalog. They built it about 3 years ago on the hill behind me. Never had much reason to care what they were doing up there. Their land, their problem. At least that's what I thought. Halfway down the wall, something caught my eye. Fresh concrete. Pale gray against darker stone. It stuck out like a scar. I walked closer and crouched down, and that's when I saw it. A pipe. A brand new storm drain pipe about a foot across, pushed straight through the retaining wall and pointing directly in my pasture like someone had aimed it there on purpose. Water was pouring out of it in a steady stream, not a trickle, not runoff, but a constant flow that had carved a muddy channel across my field. I didn't say anything at first, just stood there looking at it. Because once you understand what you're looking at, you can't pretend you don't. The retention pond for the subdivision sits just above that wall. I'd seen the construction trucks when they built it, the bulldozers scraping that hillside raw for months. Apparently, when they redesigned the drainage system for the second phase of Briar Ridge, they decided the easiest solution for all that stormwater was to push it through a pipe and let gravity deal with the rest. And gravity led straight into my pasture. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. The pipe, the water, the channel it had carved through the grass, the trash floating in it. I took a video too, walking the length of the fence, so there'd be no question where that water was coming from. Then I climbed back up the hill to the house and found the number for the property management office listed on the Briar Ridge website. The man who answered introduced himself as Trent Holloway. I met him once before at a county meeting about road access. Slick hair, pressed shirt, the kind of polite voice that sounds practiced. Briar Ridge Estates, this is Trent. Yeah, Trent, I said. This is Caleb Mercer. I own the pasture directly below your retaining wall. There was a short pause. Not long, but long enough that I could tell he already knew what I was about to say. All right, he said. How can I help you? I looked out the kitchen window toward the field that had been green 3 days ago and now looked like a shallow lake. I'm standing here looking at a brand new drainage pipe sticking through your wall and dumping stormwater onto my property. Care to explain that? Another pause. This one's shorter. Then a sigh. Oh, that. Yes, that's part of the updated runoff management plan for the retention basin. Runoff management? I repeated. Is that what we're calling it? Your property sits at a lower elevation, Mr. Mercer. Water follows natural grade. This is standard engineering practice. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes when someone says something ridiculous, laughter just comes out before anger does. A 12-inch concrete pipe blasting water into my pasture is natural. It's within code, he said, his voice getting slightly tighter. Did you get an easement from me? That silence came back again. Longer this time. No, he finally said. We didn't require one. That was the moment something shifted. Up until then, I'd been thinking maybe this was a misunderstanding. Maybe someone had made a mistake on a blueprint somewhere. But the way he said that, like the question itself was unnecessary, told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't asked because they hadn't planned to. My land was simply the lowest spot on their map, a convenient direction for their problem to flow. I'll be in touch, I told him, and hung up before the conversation turned into something I'd regret later. I stood there in the kitchen looking out at that water creeping across my pasture and realized something important. This wasn't going to get fixed with a polite phone call. That night, I didn't sleep much. Rain sounds different when you know exactly where it's headed. Every drop hitting the roof felt like it was sliding down the hill through that pipe and straight into my land. By morning, the pasture looked worse. The water had spread another 10 yards. The grass where my horses usually grazed had turned yellow for being smothered. I drove into town after breakfast and stopped by the county planning office. It's a plain building, beige walls, flickering fluorescent lights, the kind of place where paperwork goes to sit for a while. The woman at the counter recognized me. Denise. I'd pulled permits through her before when I repaired the barn roof a few years back. "Morning, Caleb," she said. "What can we do for you?" I laid my phone on the counter and showed her the pictures. Did Briar Ridge file any permits for a drainage modification that pushes water onto my parcel? She frowned and started typing. The computer hummed while she searched through county records. After about 30 seconds, she shook her head slowly. "Not seeing anything tied to your property. So they can just drill a pipe through a retaining wall and dump water downhill?" She gave that half-shrug government workers have when they know the answer, but can't say it too strongly. "You can file a complaint. An inspector will look at it." "How long?" She glanced toward the back office like she was calculating how honest she could be. "Couple weeks maybe. Depends on workload." I thought about my pasture turning into a pond while paperwork moved from one desk to another. "My field's underwater now." "I understand," she said quietly. And I believe she did. But understanding doesn't move paperwork faster. I filled out the complaint form anyway, paid the filing fee, and walked out with a carbon copy in my hand and a sinking feeling in my gut. By the time the county got around to investigating, my horses would be grazing on algae. When I got home, Walt was leaning against the fence by the driveway, chewing on a toothpick and staring down at that pipe like it had personally insulted him. Walt's been my neighbor longer than Briar Ridge has existed. He remembers when that entire ridge used to be tobacco fields. "They do that without asking you?" he said when I walked up. "Sure did." He spat into the mud. "That ain't right." "No," I said, watching the steady stream of water still pouring from the pipe, even though the rain had stopped hours ago. "It's not." We stood there a while in silence. Then Walt looked at me sideways and asked a question that stuck in my head long after he walked back to his place. "You gonna let it stand?" I didn't answer him right away, because the truth was I didn't know yet. I'm not the kind of man who goes looking for fights, but I do believe in lines, fences, deeds, boundaries, the kind you don't cross without asking. And standing there watching that water run across my pasture, it started to feel less like a drainage issue and more like someone had decided my land was the easiest place to dump their problem. I called Trent again that afternoon. "Look," I said, keeping my voice steady, "the county doesn't have any permit records for that pipe. You installed something that redirects runoff onto my land. That's damage." "It's not damage," he said smoothly. "It's water. You changed the flow. It's within acceptable engineering standards." "Engineering for who?" There was a pause, then his tone cooled a little. "Caleb, with all due respect, the subdivision has dozens of homeowners relying on proper drainage. We can't have water backing up into their yards." I looked out at the pasture that used to be dry ground. "And I can." That question hung there for a second before he answered. "We're willing to monitor the situation," he said. "If there's excessive impact, we can reassess." Define excessive. Structural damage. Verified loss. I leaned against the porch railing and watched the muddy stream continue to pour from that pipe. "So, my barn needs to flood before you care?" He didn't answer that. Instead, he said, "I think we're done here," and hung up. I stood there holding the phone and felt something colder than anger settle in. This hadn't been an accident. It had been a calculation. Somewhere in a meeting room, someone had looked at a map and decided it was cheaper to let one guy with a barn deal with their water than to redesign their system. And they were betting I'd just accept it. That night, I pulled out the folder with my property documents and spread the deed across the kitchen table. Every line, every boundary description, every elevation note. There were no easements granted to Briar Ridge Estates. No shared drainage agreement. Nothing giving them the right to turn my pasture into the outlet for their retention pond. Then I opened my laptop and started reading about Kentucky water law. And about halfway through the second article, I found a phrase that kept repeating itself. Landowners are allowed to protect their property from surface water. Protect their property. I read that line 3 times. Because the more I looked at the situation in my field, the more one thought kept coming back to me. If they believed gravity made my land responsible for their problem, what would happen if gravity stopped cooperating? And that was the moment I stopped thinking about complaints and started thinking about solutions. The kind you build with your own hands. And the next morning, I made a phone call to Walt. Walt picked up on the second ring. "You finally ready to do something about it?" he asked before I even said hello. That's the thing about neighbors who've known you long enough. They can hear decisions in your breathing. "You still got that backhoe?" I asked. There was a short pause, then a low chuckle on the other end. "I was wondering when you'd ask." We didn't say much more after that. Didn't need to. When you've spent years around people who work land for a living, plans get made in half sentences. I hung up and stood there in the kitchen a minute, staring at the muddy water creeping across my pasture. The pipe was still pouring like it had somewhere important to be, somewhere that apparently wasn't my problem anymore. By mid-morning, I'd already called the gravel yard in town and arranged for 2 truckloads of clay-filled dirt. Not the sandy stuff that washes away after the first hard rain, but the dense red clay that packs tight and holds its shape. The man on the phone asked where I wanted it dumped. "Right along my fence line," I said. "Every bit of it." Around noon, Walt's pickup rolled into my driveway, pulling the old trailer with the backhoe strapped down behind it. The machine looked like it had seen more birthdays than either of us, but Walt kept his equipment the way farmers always do, patched together but dependable. He climbed out of the truck chewing that same toothpick and looked down toward the field. "That's a lot of water," he said. "Yeah," I replied. "And it's not stopping." He walked down the slope with me and stood there studying the pipe sticking through the retaining wall. Water streamed out of it in a steady arc, splashing into the muddy trench it had carved through the grass. "They really just ran that thing straight at your land," he said. "Sure did." Walt spat the toothpick into the mud and shook his head slowly. "City people." The first dump truck arrived about half an hour later, rumbling down the gravel road and backing up along the fence line. The driver tilted the bed, and a pile of thick red clay slid out onto the ground with a heavy thud. I watched it settle there like the first brick in a wall. When the second truck came through and dropped its load beside the first, the plan started looking less like a thought and more like something real. Walt climbed into the backhoe and fired up the engine. The old machine coughed once, twice, then settled into that steady diesel growl that sounds like work getting done. "You sure about this?" he called down to me over the noise. I looked back toward the pipe. "I'm sure I'm done being convenient." The first scoop of clay came down just inside my fence line, about 10 feet from the retaining wall. We weren't touching their property, not crossing the fence. Everything stayed on my side. That part mattered. Walt worked slowly, dragging the clay into a long ridge that stretched along the length of the wall. I followed behind with a shovel, packing the edges and filling gaps where the soil needed more weight. By the time we reached the section where the pipe stuck through, the berm had grown to about 2 feet high and nearly 4 feet thick at the base. Solid. Stubborn. The kind of barrier you don't push through easily. "You planning to block the pipe itself?" Walt asked. "No," I said. "Their pipe stays exactly where it is." Instead, we built the clay wall so it curved slightly around the mouth of the pipe like a shallow bowl. I laid down a thick sheet of plastic liner against the clay, the kind people use when building ponds, and pressed it tight into place. Then we stacked cinder blocks around the edge where the water hit hardest, pressing them into the clay so the flow wouldn't erode it away. It wasn't pretty, but it didn't need to be. The point wasn't aesthetics. The point was physics. If water came out of that pipe now, it would hit a wall instead of my pasture. And when water can't go downhill the way it expects to, it starts looking for another direction. Walt shut off the engine after the last scoop and climbed down from the machine. We stood there looking at the berm stretching along the fence line. From a distance, it almost looked like it belonged there, like the land had always had that spine running through it. "Well," Walt said, wiping his hands on his jeans, "that'll change a few things." That's the idea. For the next 2 days, nothing happened. The sky cleared and the sun came out, and the pasture began to dry in patches where the water had been shallow. The horses stayed up near the barn, eyeing the new clay ridge with cautious curiosity, but otherwise going about their routine. Part of me wondered if maybe the storm system had just been a fluke. Maybe the retention pond up on the ridge had already drained enough that the pipe wouldn't push much more water through. Then Sunday afternoon rolled in with that kind of heavy air that makes the trees go quiet. I've lived here long enough to recognize the feeling before the first drop even hits the ground. A storm was coming. I moved the horses into the barn before sunset and shut the doors. Not because I was worried about them getting wet, but because I knew exactly where the water would go once the rain started. By nightfall, the sky had turned the color of old steel. Thunder rolled somewhere out beyond the ridge, low and distant at first. I sat on the porch watching the retaining wall at the far edge of the pasture fade into the dark. Around 8, the rain began. Slow at first, then steadier, the kind of rain that builds into a rhythm on the roof. I grabbed a flashlight and walked halfway down the slope toward the berm. Water was already pouring from the pipe again, stronger than before, splashing hard against the clay wall and pooling behind the curved barrier we'd built. For a minute, it just churned there, pushing and swirling like it was deciding what to do next. Then the levels started rising. The clay held. The blocks held. Instead of spilling across my pasture, the water pressed back toward the retaining wall. I stood there watching it happen in real time, the beam of my flashlight catching the muddy surface as it crept higher against the pipe. I didn't cheer, didn't say a word. I just turned around and walked back up to the house. Some things don't need commentary. I sat in the wooden chair on my porch and listened to the rain. Hours passed that way. The storm kept building, thunder cracking closer now, wind pushing sheets of water across the fields. Somewhere after midnight, I saw the first lights appear on the ridge. At first just a flicker through the trees. Then more. Flashlights. Headlights. A pair of truck beams sweeping across the retention pond area. Even from down here, I could tell something wasn't right up there. I leaned forward in the chair, elbows on my knees, watching the lights move back and forth like people searching for a problem they hadn't expected to find. A few minutes later, the faint whine of a pump carried down the hill through the rain. That sound told me everything I needed to know. Water, when it can't go where it was designed to go, finds somewhere else. And tonight, that somewhere wasn't my pasture anymore. By the time the rain slowed near dawn, the lights on the ridge were still moving. Trucks parked where they'd never parked before. People walking the edge of the retention pond with flashlights cutting through the mist. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stepped out onto the porch just as the sky started turning gray. From my yard, I could see the top edge of Briar Ridge Estates clearly enough now. The pond that usually sat neat and controlled behind its decorative fence had swelled far past where it was supposed to. Water had spilled over the walking trail that curved around it, and down the line of houses nearest the ridge, hoses snaked across the lawns where sump pumps were running full blast. I took a slow sip of coffee. Gravity hadn't changed, only the direction it was allowed to work. And about 20 minutes later, a black SUV came flying down the access road toward my gate. The black SUV didn't slow down until it hit the gravel near my gate, tires spitting stones as it stopped. The driver's door flew open before the engine even finished idling. Trent Holloway stepped out looking like a man who'd skipped the part of the morning where people usually collect themselves. His hair was damp from the mist, his loafers already picking up gravel and mud as he marched up my driveway. I didn't move from the porch. I just leaned back in the chair and took another sip of coffee while he closed the distance between us. "What did you do?" he demanded before he even reached the steps. "No felo, no pretense." Just that. I let the silence hang a moment, mostly because I wanted to see how long it would take him to realize he'd skipped a few basic steps in the conversation. "Morning to you too," I said finally. His jaw tightened. "You obstructed the drainage outlet." I set the mug down on the porch rail and looked past him toward the ridge. From where I sat, I could still see the water sitting high around the retention pond. Did I? I said. The pond is backing up, he snapped. We've got homes taking on water. I nodded slowly, like I was processing the information for the first time. That sounds serious. Trent took a step closer. Remove whatever you build down there. No, I didn't raise my voice. Didn't lean forward. Just said it the way a man says something he's already thought through. His eyebrows lifted slightly, like he wasn't used to hearing that word directed at him. You can't just block engineered drainage, he said. I didn't block anything on your side, I replied. I built a berm on my property, entirely inside my fence. He opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. For the first time since he'd arrived, he seemed to realize that the conversation might not follow the script he expected. You're causing damage to the subdivision, he said after a second. No, I said calmly. Your design is. His patience thinned. I could see it in the way he shifted his weight and ran a hand across his forehead. 3 homeowners have water in their basements right now. I looked him in the eye, and I had water in my barn. He didn't answer that, because we both knew the next part of the sentence didn't need to be spoken for it to land. Or did that not count? We stood there for a few seconds, the quiet stretching between us. Finally, Trent pulled his phone from his pocket and turned slightly away, muttering something into it. Probably calling someone else from the HOA board. I leaned back again and picked up my coffee. The steam was gone now, but the taste was still good enough. 10 minutes later, another car came down the access road. Then another. 2 more people stepped out and walked up the driveway toward the house, both dressed the way people dress when they think they're arriving to handle a problem rather than be part of it. One of them I recognized from a community meeting months earlier. Patricia. She was the one who'd spent 15 minutes arguing about mailbox colors while the rest of the room tried not to fall asleep. She stopped at the bottom of my porch steps and crossed her arms. You're Kayla Mercer? That's me. We've been informed you've intentionally obstructed our drainage outlet. No, I said. I've protected my property. Her expression tightened the way someone's does when they hear words they don't like but can't immediately argue against. Your actions are affecting dozens of residents, she said sharply. You live adjacent to Briar Ridge. There's a responsibility that comes with that. I let out a quiet breath. Your actions affected me first. She opened her mouth to respond, but I kept going. You ran a pipe through that wall without asking, without an easement, without a permit tied to my parcel. Trent glanced toward her then, clearly hoping she'd steer the conversation back into territory where they were comfortable. Instead, she doubled down. We are fully prepared to pursue legal action if necessary, she said. Injunctions. Emergency orders. I shrugged. You're welcome to try. Something about the calm in that answer seemed to irritate her more than if I'd yelled. But before the conversation could spiral any further, the sound of another vehicle rolled up the road behind them. This one was different. White truck, county logo on the door. Trent noticed it at the same time I did. His shoulders stiffened slightly as the vehicle pulled up behind the others and parked along the edge of the driveway. The man who stepped out looked like someone who'd spent his career walking properties and measuring things people hoped he wouldn't measure too closely. Tall, late 40s maybe, clipboard already in hand before the truck door fully shut. He approached the group slowly, scanning the ridge, the pasture, the retaining wall. Morning, he said. Greg Martin, county inspector. Denise must have pushed my complaint through faster than she'd expected. Trent forced a smile that looked about as comfortable as a shoe 2 sizes too small. We were just discussing a misunderstanding, he said. Greg didn't answer that. Instead, he walked past the group and headed straight toward the fence line. I followed him down the slope while the others trailed behind. He crouched near the berm and studied the clay ridge, the plastic liner, the stacked cinder blocks forming the curved barrier around the pipe. Then he stood and walked along the length of the fence, taking photos with his phone. When was this pipe installed? He asked without looking up. About 2 weeks ago, I said. Did anyone notify you beforehand? No. Greg scribbled something on a clipboard. Then he turned toward Trent. Permit number? Trent blinked once. We're finalizing some paperwork. Greg looked back at the pipe, then at the water stains climbing the inside of the retaining wall, where the level had risen overnight. The infrastructure is already operational, he said flatly. Yes, but operational systems require approved modification permits, Greg continued, his tone still calm, but noticeably firmer, especially when redirecting concentrated runoff onto adjacent parcels. No one spoke for a few seconds. Even Patricia seemed unsure where to step into the conversation now. Greg finished taking a few more photos and then walked up the slope toward the ridge, disappearing briefly behind the retaining wall as he inspected the pond itself. From where I stood, I could see Trent's expression change slowly as the situation began settling into a shape he hadn't planned for. When Greg returned 15 minutes later, he walked straight past Trent and stopped in front of me. "Your complaint was filed yesterday morning?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded once. Then he turned back toward the group from Briar Ridge. "Based on what I've seen so far," he said, "this installation appears to have been completed without proper authorization." Patricia's face tightened immediately. "There must be some mistake." Greg raised a hand slightly. Not aggressively, just enough to pause the interruption. "Redirecting stormwater discharge onto neighboring property without an easement is a violation." Trent's face had gone pale now, the color draining from it like water through a cracked pipe. "We can resolve this internally," he said quickly. Greg shook his head once. "That won't be necessary." The quiet that followed felt heavier than the storm clouds that had passed through the night before. And in that moment, standing there beside the berm wall and I had built with a borrowed backhoe and 2 truckloads of clay, I realized something simple. For the first time since this whole mess started, the problem wasn't flowing downhill toward me anymore. It had finally reached level ground, and gravity, like it always does, was about to take it somewhere else. No one said anything for a moment after Greg finished speaking. The wind had picked up slightly, pushing the last pieces of cloud across the sky above the ridge, but down near the fence line, everything felt strangely still. Trent looked like a man who had just realized the rules of the game weren't the ones he thought they were. Patricia crossed her arms tighter, her expression shifting from confident irritation to something more defensive. Greg, on the other hand, didn't seem particularly interested in their reactions. He flipped a page on a clipboard and continued writing as if this sort of situation happened 3 times before lunch every day. Trent cleared his throat. "Look," he said, trying to pull the conversation back into familiar territory, "we're obviously willing to cooperate with the county if something was overlooked." Greg didn't look up. "Overlooked?" Patricia added quickly, seizing the opportunity. "This was part of a professionally engineered drainage system." Greg finally raised his eyes from the clipboard and looked directly at them. "Engineered or not," he said calmly, "you can't redirect concentrated runoff onto someone else's property without authorization." That sentence landed harder than anything said so far, because it wasn't an opinion. It was the kind of statement that turns arguments into paperwork. Trent shifted his weight again. "Well, clearly the situation has become complicated, but this berm here is also interfering with the system." Greg glanced toward the clay ridge. Then he looked at me. "Did you build this entirely on your side of the property line?" he asked. "Yes." "Did you enter their land at any point?" "No." He nodded once, like a box had just been checked. Then he turned back to Trent. "Then that's not the violation." You could almost hear the air leave Trent's lungs. For the first time since arriving, he didn't have a quick answer ready. Greg continued walking along the fence line, examining the retaining wall, the pipe, the marks where water had pushed upward overnight. He took more photos, measured the distance from the pipe to the fence, and wrote something down that looked very official. Meanwhile, the 3 HOA representatives stood there trying to figure out how the situation had flipped so quickly. From the start, they had assumed this would be simple. Drive down, pressure the landowner, get the berm removed. Problem solved. Instead, they were now standing next to a county inspector who had just used the word violation. That word changes conversations. After another minute, Greg closed the clipboard and addressed the group again. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to provide documentation for the drainage modification that installed this pipe." Trent opened his mouth. Greg raised a hand. "If that documentation exists." Silence again. Greg continued. "And if it doesn't, you're going to need to correct the situation immediately." Patricia's voice came out sharper than before. Corrected how? Greg gestured toward the ridge. By containing your runoff within your own property. That answer clearly wasn't what she wanted to hear. You can't expect an entire subdivision to redesign its drainage system because one neighbor doesn't like where the water goes. Greg's expression didn't change. I don't expect anything, he said. I enforce code. That ended the debate, at least officially. But frustration still hung in the air like leftover thunder from the night before. Trent rubbed his forehead and looked toward the ridge again, where the retention pond still sat high and swollen behind the fence. How long do we have? He asked. Greg flipped back through the clipboard. I'll be filing an initial report this afternoon, he said. Given the conditions I observed, the county will likely require immediate temporary mitigation. Temporary mitigation? Patricia repeated. Pumps, Greg said simply. Diversion. Whatever it takes to stop discharge onto this parcel. He pointed toward my pasture. And then you'll need to submit a revised drainage plan that complies with county regulations. Trent exhaled slowly. I could almost see the numbers starting to run through his head. Engineers, contractors, construction, none of it cheap. Greg looked at me next. In the meantime, he said, you're within your rights to maintain any protective measures on your property. I nodded once. Understood. Greg walked back toward his truck after that, already dialing a number on his phone as he went. The moment he drove away, the tone of the conversation changed again. Not louder, but colder. Trent turned back toward me, his jaw tight. This didn't need to turn into a county issue, he said. I leaned against the porch railing. It already was. You could have just called. I did. He didn't respond, because we both knew how that call had gone. Patricia stepped forward then. You realize you've created a major problem for dozens of homeowners. I shrugged slightly. You created it first. Her eyes narrowed. You think this is some kind of victory? No. I looked past them toward the ridge again, where the pond water still sat higher than it should have. I think it's gravity. Trent followed my gaze. For a moment, none of us spoke, because the reality of the situation was now obvious to everyone standing there. Before the berm, their system worked perfectly. The water flowed exactly where they wanted it, through the pipe, across my land, away from their houses. Now that path was gone, and water always finds the next lowest place. Eventually, Patricia broke the silence. We'll handle it, she said sharply. I'm sure you will. They left not long after that. The black SUV backed out of my driveway first, followed by the other two cars. Gravel crunched under their tires as they drove back toward the ridge, the tension from the conversation still hanging behind them like dust in the air. I watched them disappear up the road. Then I went back inside and finished the coffee that had gone cold during the whole exchange. The rest of that day was quiet. Too quiet. But if you've lived around land long enough, you know quiet rarely lasts. By late afternoon, the first contractor trucks started appearing on the ridge. From my pasture, I could see workers setting up large pumps near the retention pond, long hoses snaking across the ground toward drainage ditches farther away from the subdivision. They worked until sunset. Then they worked with floodlights. Because when water starts moving somewhere it shouldn't, people suddenly find motivation they didn't have before. By the second morning, the pumps were running nonstop. The constant mechanical hum drifted down the hill like distant traffic. Walt stopped by again around mid-morning, leaning against the fence the same way he had the day before. Well, he said, watching the activity on the ridge, looks like they're busy. Yep. He studied the pond for another minute. You think they'll fix it? Oh, they'll fix it, I said. The only question now was how expensive the lesson was going to be. Over the next week, the subdivision looked less like a quiet neighborhood and more like a construction zone. Engineers walked the property with surveying equipment. Contractors marked sections of trail with spray paint. Excavators appeared near the pond. Word spread quickly through the houses up there about what had happened. Some residents were angry. Not at the board. At me. From their perspective, the story was simple. Before the berm, everything worked. After the berm, their basements flooded. Cause and effect. What they didn't see was the pipe that had been quietly dumping water into my pasture for weeks before anyone noticed. Or the calls that had gone nowhere. Or the assumption that one man's land was easier to sacrifice than redesigning a system. One evening about 10 days later, someone knocked on my door. Not Trent. Not Patricia. Just a man in his mid-30s I'd never met before. He stood there awkwardly on the porch, holding his hands together, like he wasn't sure how the conversation was supposed to start. "Caleb," he asked. "That's me. I live up in Briar Ridge, near the tennis courts." I nodded. "My basement flooded the night of that storm," he said. I waited. He glanced out toward the pasture where the grass had finally started drying again. "I just wanted to understand something," he said quietly. "Did you have to block it like that?" I stepped out onto the porch beside him and leaned on the railing. "I asked them to fix it," I said. "They told me it was standard practice." He rubbed the back of his neck. "They told us the drainage system was fully engineered." "I'm sure parts of it were," I said. "Just not the part that ended on my fence." He stared out over the field for a while. "My kid's playroom got ruined," he said eventually. I nodded slowly. "I am sorry." And I meant that. But there was something else that needed to be said, too. "But it was either your playroom," I added quietly, "or my barn." He didn't respond right away. Because sometimes the truth isn't complicated. It's just uncomfortable. After another minute, he nodded once, almost to himself. Then he thanked me for explaining and walked back down the driveway toward the road. I watched him go, and as the sun set behind the ridge that evening, the construction lights flicked on again up at Briar Ridge Estates. Because the engineers had finally reached the same conclusion I had weeks earlier. The water had to stay on their side. And fixing that mistake was going to take a lot more than one pipe through a wall. By the end of the second week, the ridge didn't look like a neighborhood anymore. It looked like a job site that had been rushed into existence because someone finally realized a mistake was costing real money. Every morning, I could hear engines start up before the sun was fully over the trees. Excavators moving dirt. Pumps still humming. Trucks coming and going along the ridge road like they were trying to outrun the problem. I didn't go up there. Didn't need to. From my pasture, I could see enough to understand what was happening. The walking trail around the retention pond had been torn open in two places. Survey stakes stuck out of the ground like little flags marking where the new drainage lines would go. And every few days, another contractor truck appeared carrying more pipe, more gravel, more equipment. Walt came by most mornings around the same time. Sometimes he brought coffee. Sometimes he just leaned against the fence and watched the activity on the ridge with the same quiet patience he'd had the day this all started. "They're digging deeper today," he said one morning, nodding toward the pond. I looked up from the fence rail. Sure enough, an excavator was scooping out the edge of the basin, widening it and reinforcing the slope with stone. "Containment," I said. Walt chuckled softly. "Expensive containment." He wasn't wrong. Word around town travels faster than official reports, and within a few days, I started hearing numbers. Contractors don't keep secrets when they're standing in line at the gas station buying coffee. By the end of the month, the total cost floating around was somewhere close to $200,000. $200,000 to redesign the drainage system, so the water stayed inside Briar Ridge Estates where it had always belonged in the first place. I never confirmed the number with anyone from the HOA. Didn't need to. You could see the money in the amount of work happening up there. Entire sections of the walking trail had been ripped up. New underground pipes were being laid that curved back toward a reinforced basin built entirely within the subdivision boundary. They even expanded the overflow controls on the pond so that if the water level ever rose that high again, it would discharge safely into a channel leading away from the houses, away from my land. The original pipe through the retaining wall stayed in place for a few weeks while the redesign was underway. It didn't matter anymore. The berm still stood where Walt and I had built it, and the temporary pumps kept the pond from filling high enough to test it again. Eventually, one afternoon, I watched a crew climb down to the base of the wall and start cutting the concrete pipe out piece by piece. By sunset, the opening was sealed with fresh stonework that matched the rest of the wall so cleanly it almost looked like nothing had ever been there. Almost. I walked down to the fence line after the workers left and stood there looking at the spot where that pipe had been. The grass nearby was starting to come back. A few weeks earlier, the ground had been nothing but mud and standing water. Now the soil was dry again. The horses had already wandered down to their favorite grazing area like the entire situation had been a brief inconvenience rather than the center of a small war between neighbors. The berm stayed, not because it was still necessary, but because I had no reason to remove it. And if I'm honest, it served as a quiet reminder. Summer rolled in slowly after that. 2 more storms passed through the county over the next couple months, the kind of heavy rain that used to keep me awake wondering where all that water would end up. Both times I walked down to the pasture the next morning and found the ground firm under my boots. No standing water, no muddy trench cutting across the field. Just the land behaving the way it had for the 15 years I'd owned it. Briar Ridge looked normal again, too. Lawns trimmed, kids riding bikes along the sidewalks. The walking trail repaired. If you didn't know what had happened a few months earlier, you'd never guess the entire drainage system beneath that neighborhood had been rebuilt because of one small pipe pointed in the wrong direction. I only saw Trent once after everything was finished. It was at the grocery store in town. He was standing near the checkout line, holding a basket with a few items in it. For a second, we just looked at each other the way people do when there's history neither of them plans to discuss in public. Then he nodded once. I nodded back. No apology. No argument. Just an understanding that the situation had resolved itself in a way neither of us could change now. I didn't hate the people up on that ridge. That part surprised some folks when they asked about it later. Anger takes more energy than I'm willing to spend on people who already learned their lesson the hard way. And from what I heard through the grapevine, the HOA board had plenty of internal problems to deal with after the flooding incident. Several homeowners had demanded explanations about why their basements filled with water in the first place. A couple of them even talked about legal action against the board for approving a drainage modification without proper permits. I stayed out of that. My part in the story ended the moment the water stopped flowing across my land. But something about the experience did change the way I look at situations like this. Before all of it happened, I probably would have believed what a lot of people believe about conflicts between neighbors. That most problems come from misunderstandings. That if you talk things through calmly, people usually find a fair solution. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes all it takes is a conversation and a little patience. But other times the conversation already happened, and the other side decided your problem was acceptable collateral damage for their convenience. That's the part people don't like to admit. When a group has more influence, more money, or simply more numbers behind them, it becomes easy to assume the smaller voice will eventually give up, that they'll tolerate the inconvenience. Wait their turn. Accept the situation. Maybe some people would have. Maybe some people would have watched their pasture turn into a drainage ditch and decided it wasn't worth the fight. I don't blame anyone who chooses that path. Every situation has its own cost. But standing there that morning when I first saw the pipe pouring water into my field, something about it crossed a line I couldn't ignore. Not the water itself. Water is just physics doing its job. The problem was the decision behind it. Someone looked at a map and decided my land was the easiest place to send their problem. They assumed I would accept it because fighting back seemed harder than staying quiet. That assumption turned out to be expensive. These days when I walk down to the pasture and see the horses grazing where that muddy channel used to be, I think about how close the whole situation came to turning out differently. If I'd waited for the county complaint process to run its course. If I'd taken Trent's advice to monitor the situation. If I'd accepted that dozens of homeowners deserved dry yards more than one man deserved a dry barn. But the truth is simpler than that. I didn't block their drainage system. I just stopped allowing it to run through my property. Gravity handled the rest. And that's really the lesson in all of it. Boundaries only matter when someone is willing to enforce them. Not angrily, not violently, just firmly enough that the line stays where it belongs. Because the moment people start believing those lines are negotiable, they'll push them as far as they can, until the day someone quietly pushes back. The berm out by my fence line still sits there today. Grass has grown over most of it now, blending into the pasture so naturally that visitors barely notice it unless I point it out. But I see it every time I walk that field. A simple ridge of clay that reminded a whole subdivision where their water was supposed to go. Some folks around town say I overreacted. Others say the HOA got exactly what they deserved. Personally, I think the truth sits somewhere in the middle. I protected what was mine. They fixed what was theirs, and gravity sorted out the rest. So I'll leave the final judgment to you. If someone redirected their problem onto your land because it was easier than solving it themselves, would you quietly accept it? Or would you put your ground back where it belongs and let nature decide what happens next?